Hi, I'd like to give you an overview of the assassination of President William McKinley. It's not something that's really covered much in history, and bearing in mind that the US have unfortunately lost four presidents, the last of which being JFK, which was profound at the time, certainly given the nature in which he was lost to the US people. I thought it important to go through how maybe those events are connected. I've become a student of Anthony C. Sutton, and I've been looking at his work. His work includes the American Secret Establishment, which is effectively Skull and Bones, or the Brotherhood of Death, or the Order as they're also known. And what you find is, as you go through the names, because there's a list of around 2,700 names at the back of the document, the book, that takes you up to around 2006 for the names of people that were tapped into that. I wouldn't call them a fraternity. I think they are more of a secret establishment. Their names were published in the New York Times, but then the New York Times was effectively founded. Well, it was founded by the father of Skull and Bonesman, and actually he died the same year by heart attack, the year that his son, I think, was tapped into or graduated from Skull and Bones, and I can show you that in a moment. But effectively, when you go through the administration, a number of names jump out at you, and they are the secret societies of Skull and Bones, Scroll and Key, Wolf's Head. They were established back in 1833 at Yale University. Scroll and Key was established 9 years later, and then after that, I think it's in the 1880s, Wolf's Head was established. And a lot of the wealthy family money, such as Standard Oil money, has really financed the setting up and the creation of these societies over time, and others. But anyway, to get back on track, to really understand how we lost, how the US lost William McKinley, I thought it important to just look at the surrounding factors to that. I have another presentation that covers JFK, so please look and you'll find that there. What I'll do is scroll down to William McKinley, and we'll look at what's going on around that time as well, to give you some background. Bearing in mind that there's been an awful lot of graduates from the secret societies at Yale, and obviously being Yale, they've been considered highly employable. So what you find when you look back through history is that Skull and Bonesmen have been a part of the administration all the way back since, well, so far I've traced it back to Millard Fillmore, who had at least three, and I put to be completed, because there are multiple secret societies at the Yale University, and others such as LU that I haven't mentioned so far. And even if you go back further, you find that Zachary Taylor, the general, the great general of the Mexican-American War, his son Richard Taylor was tapped into the secret societies. So Skull and Bones 1845. And so when you look at historical events, what you find is that when you look at them and you look at the people connected to them, even if you were to go up to, say, the American Civil War, Skull and Bonesmen are on both sides. They're fighting each other. They're even connected as the executive management to Jefferson Davis's Confederate States of America presidency. The William Preston Johnston, who was the aide-de-camp to President Jefferson Davis. You've got Colonel Burton Norvell Harrison, who was the enlisted in the Confederate Army. Okay, he was a private secretary to the Confederate leader Jefferson. So there's very close connections there. And when you take on board the ideology that they've been using, and this is clearly stated by Anthony C. Sutton, and that is the use of Hegelian dialect, the process of creating conflict, controlling both sides of the argument, creating a vacuum effectively around that argument, presumably by controlling the media, newspapers, and then directing the conflict in such a way that you can take the outcome, the change that you want from that conflict. By doing that on large events such as wars, such as those other social issues, no matter what it is, whether it's being Republican, whether it's been Democrat, you'll find skull and bones on both sides, although they tend to lean towards the Democrat side because of the the working class man, and that's despite them being on effectively the executive management to the extremely wealthy families. So you can see inherently the conflict there. But also it takes us into war and waging war on both sides. Yeah, there isn't a conflict. And then when you look at events like that, you find there's connections with John Brown, who's actually a very close family friend, personal friend of Philip Grey Russell, who is the co-founder of Skull and Bones. That's William Huntington Russell. And then when you look at his work, he's set up the Russell Military Academy in September 1836, and there's a number of recruits coming out of that as well, and the very prominent people that were assigned diplomatic posts, US ambassadors to Austria, suspiciously around the time of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So it's worth taking a look at Frederick Pensfield. He was in the right time at the right place. And so as we go up through the presidents, let's just focus in. We find Skull and Bones there. James Garfield, quite a few Skull and Bones there, but I think maybe monetary policy may have been an issue there. I think he was pushing for monetary policy backed by gold, which historically has been a hugely controversial subject, and even today now we find ourselves not backed by gold. We find ourselves with a fiat currency that has no gold backing. Okay, then we have Chester A. Arthur, who was the 21st President of the United States. Again, quite a number of Skull and Bonesmen, and that's to be completed. I'm still going through the list. I've got about 2,000 of the names down at the moment, analysed, and I'm mapping them in. But I need to make progress. I wanted to share the information, so I'm starting to publish this material for you. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting, because you have Grover Cleveland. Now, he comes back twice as first of all as the 22nd, and then as the 24th President of the United States. In between, he joins Davis, Pollard, Wardwell, Gardner, and Reed. And that is the Skull and Bones solicitors. There's quite a few working there. There's many connections to Skull and Bones. So he's very much in the mix. There's lots of things going around here, including the dedication of the Statue of Liberty, which is actually held and done by Eben Alexander, who's Skull and Bones. Okay, so then we get into Benjamin Harrison, Skull and Bones. He only stays for one term, but importantly, William Howard Taft is in there as a Solicitor General of the United States. So I imagine at that point, he's pretty happy. And there's a number of things playing out around now, because you've got Andrew D. White, you've got Eben Alexander. They're all out there as diplomats to Europe and to the East. And interestingly, around that sort of time, you've also got members of the royal family dying. So there's things going on. And when you look at the countries they're connected to, that's highly suspicious. And I'll do a separate video on that. But it's worth looking at that. So Benjamin Harris there has William Howard Taft in it. He becomes the future president of the United States. So I imagine he's hugely happy and satisfied that Benjamin Harrison can stay at least a term. Then we go on to Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland comes back again. He's the 24th US president. And we've got the Skull and Bones that I know of at this point. Let's just scroll back and see what else is going on. And this is where we kind of get into the territory of the American-Spanish War that happens under William McKinley. Now, I must say, I'm not a historian. That's not my background. I've developed an interest in history on the back of Anthony C. Sutton's work and the fact there's so many discrepancies from what I understand in it. And then when you look at Anthony C. Sutton's work, it's almost self-supporting, because what he's doing is he's explaining in a very academic way what's wrong with our history. And then at the end of his career, or near the end of his career, he gets the list of Skull and Bonesmen from Charlotte Elizabeth, who's the daughter and granddaughter of Skull and Bonesmen, who considered them actually highly conflicted people. And she leaked the names to him. He was able to photocopy the names and then reconciled the names back to the historical events, the people in various positions, and found out actually they're all very much connected by the secret societies of Yale, predominantly Skull and Bones, which was established by William Huntington Russell and Alfonso Taft. And so as we look at this period in time, what we find is we have the Spanish-American War. That graphic's probably a little bit misleading, because by that point they had become industrial. They had the ability to produce boats, metal boats, and warships. And so yeah, it's a lovely picture of people on horseback and one thing or another. I suspect they were fighting that way. But also by boat, they certainly had the ability to fire at each other and blow each other up. Very sadly. So again, lots of people, Skull and Bones, connected with those events. Yeah, that's just a sample. I suspect there's a lot more. Again, and many of those people would be very senior people. They've certainly promoted themselves up through organisations. They've had people in charge, such as Grover Cleveland and other presidents that have supported their rise. Including William Howard Taft at that point. We have JP Morgan selling his yacht to the US government to aid the war against the Spanish, and so there's already quite a lot of connections here. And that's really what I'm after. I'm interested in understanding what the connections are. And when considering connections, it's worth pointing out that I'm acutely aware that you can derive information through a perceived sense of wanting to see connections. Okay, I'm acutely aware of that, and I've wanted to stay well away from, sort of almost creatively thinking about things. I really want to keep it nuts and bolts. Who's where, doing what was their position, what responsibilities, influence, power did they have. Who were they connected with? What organisations were they affiliated to? Was it secret societies? And really sort of do analysis around that. It's worth bearing in mind, I am an analyst myself, and I'm used to looking at complex information, understanding things, and trying to create solutions to those problems, whether it's a process problem, a software problem. That's kind of my background. So to that end, there's two terms that I would bring to your attention, and that is pareidolia, which is a tendency for an incorrect perception of the stimulus of an object, seeing patterns, like seeing shapes in clouds, that kind of thing. And then apophonia, which is the tendency to mistakenly perceive connections and meaning between unrelated things. So I'm always keeping that in the back of my mind. I'm mentioning this so that you're aware of it, so that you're in a position to educate yourself about those things, so that when you take on board this information that you're quite right to question and decide for yourself. There's also another important point, and that is you need to understand how intelligence works. And again, I'm not an intelligence officer. I've not worked in the army, any of the forces. My background is that of a business analyst, and so looking at process and business processes, software solutions. So this has been new to me. But to learn, I've been listening to people that understand this sort of thing. And to me, one of those people is Major General Stubblebine, who's been quite open and frank about how intelligence works. And he likes to he refers to dots, but then he corrects that and says dots is what people talk about in intelligence. He refers to it as dots. He likes to consider intelligence information as dots of information, and that each dot in itself may not tell you that much, but gradually, as you build up the number of dots, they start to paint a picture. And for him and his communication of how intelligence works, that is how he describes it. Okay, that is how intelligence works. So you could maybe like it to a Monet picture. A Monet picture is made up of lots of dots, and it's really not until he starts to build up those dots that you start to see the picture. And in some cases, actually, maybe when you're standing up against a Monet, you just see lots of dots. So what you have to do is step back and look at the big picture. And it's that stepping back that is what I'm doing. Okay, what I've done is map on all the names, so I'm almost there. And then the intention is to step back. And I haven't even mapped them all on. I can see that there's been a huge problem in how much influence we've allowed historically. And I say we, the citizens of our countries, have allowed secret societies to have influence in areas that have had huge both political and financial and industrial influence on our society. And so I think we're right to question that, and I hope this helps. So I'll put that aside, but please keep that in the back of your mind. Let's look at the trigger event for the Spanish-American War. So every event in history usually has a trigger event. If the trigger event for the Spanish-American War is generally considered to be the USS Maine, which was sent down to Latin America. Now that was actually ordered on the 3rd of August 1886 by the US Secretary of Navy William Collins Whitney, and his Skull and Bones 1863. So we've got to go down here. And I think the president at that time, let me just double check. Oh, 1863 sounds like a long time back. Let me just double check that. 1886, yeah. Let me just see there. Okay, yeah, that's even before. So we're back to Grosvenor, Cleveland, I think. Yeah, Grosvenor, Cleveland. Okay, bearing in mind that Williams Collins Witness is there and quite a few others, so it's very much a Skull and Bones operation, plus potentially, well, you know, the wealthy families are there in the background, because that's the other thing you see when you start mapping these names on, is effectively the executive management to the very wealthy families. And so when we look at the USS Maine, that is ordered by Williams Collins Whitney, Skull and Bones 1863. So he was Skull and Bones effectively during the American War. And this is him there. Okay, so he orders the boat. The role is then handed off to Benjamin F. Tracy. And he's the 32nd United States Secretary of the Navy by President Benjamin Harrison. But interestingly, they've put someone in. The private secretary to him is Henry Warren Raymond. He's Skull and Bones 1869. Okay, now he's interesting because he's the son that I referred to earlier to Henry Warren Raymond of the same name that founded the New York Times. And his father died, I think it was the year that he was tapped, or at least the year that he graduated. It was one or the other, because it's a senior year fraternity. Okay, so we can see he's obviously the politician there, the secretary, but in the background you've got Skull and Bones. And that's the other thing you see when you go through this, is there's lots of connections to them playing either the assistant to, the secretary to, they're in the administration, they do in some instances become the president. So we've got William Howard Taft, who becomes the US president, and he's given the Mason of Light ceremony, so that he's a Freemason as well. And that happens, I think, a couple of weeks before his inauguration. But controversially, it's raised by Freemasons in the US that they were concerned that happened. He seemed to have shortcut their process, their system for becoming a Freemason, and so I think they were concerned about undue influence that maybe would come from an organisation like Skull and Bones, and their ideology of Hegelian dialect. Again, I'm not an expert in that. If you're a Freemason and you'd like to comment in the comments below, please do. I've got interested to hear all sorts of points of view. Okay, so let's just have a look. He then hands off to Hilary Herbert. So he's Delta Kappa Epsilon. So being a British man, I've had to get up to speed with the US fraternity setup. And obviously a lot of it's much older than 1833, which was Skull and Bones. I think Delta Kappa Epsilon is even older still. And they went through what was, I think, the anti-Masonic movement prior to 1833. And that forced quite a few fraternities to go public. Before that, I believe they were secret societies themselves. And so there's quite a history between actually fraternities such as Delta Kappa Epsilon and Skull and Bones. When you look at the list, what you find is that back in this period, a lot of Skull and Bones were actually more than that. They were Delta Kappa Epsilon. They were members of other fraternities as well. I think anything up to 2, 3. I think in some instances I've seen 4 fraternities. I don't really understand how they juggle that. Presumably it's kind of spread out over their earlier years as well, maybe at more sort of junior schools. But there's quite a history to it. So Hilary Herbert then hands off to, so that's basically the United States Secretary of the Navy by President Grover Cleveland. So that's from 1893 to 1897. And bear in mind, I've always tried to mention where people are involved in wars. People are involved in wars, obviously, whether they've known what's going on or not. They've committed themselves and they've put their lives on the line, and they're fighting for what they believe in. And I can only imagine that has a huge influence on an individual. And it probably shapes them as people, especially after their experiences. And so I've always tried to note that down. It's interesting to see what people are involved in. And it's important to reflect, I think, where people are committed to battles that they believe in. They are acting honourably. I do question Skull and Bones and maybe the wealthy families behind them, because clearly they've been orchestrating events. And this is probably one of them. And you'll see others through my videos. where they know what's going on, and so by participating in it, are they honourable? It's not right, is it? Makes me uneasy. So I'll carry on. Again, this is a personal view. You may agree, disagree. I'm open to discussion on it. I think that's one of the things I think we need to have is a discussion on this, especially as a society, a global society. Okay, so he's there around 1893 to 1897. Now the explosion is 1898. And what happens effectively is the boat is sent down to Latin America. I think it spends a little bit of time off the coast. I can't remember quite how long, but it blows up. Now the sleeping quarters, I think, are at the front of the boat, or at one end of the boat, and then the crew sleeping quarters are at the other end of the boat. So by far the majority of people that die on that boat are the crew. I think there are some officers that do die still. And in total, around 75% of those on board die. And we have this 1896 annual report by the Surgeon General of the United Navy that summarises the statistics. I don't quite understand why it's taken so long for this report to happen. Okay, so I was just looking at the USS Maine and the Surgeon General report, and something interesting just popped out. That was created in 1896, but there's a special appendix to it, and that's what identifies a discrepancy there. So what they did was they published the report, which is this one, the annual report of the Surgeon General, 1896, but then they updated it with a special appendix, and that special appendix includes the update then that they give in regards to the casualties occurring on the USS Maine. So I'm not sure why they've done that. There's quite a gap between the original publication of the report in 1896 and the special appendix that they've produced for that report. It's like almost sort of taking the information and stuffing it in an old report. But it does kind of illustrate the numbers of casualties and how events to a certain degree unfolded that day with the explosion. So I'll let you read that in your own time. Now the Spanish view of that is that it was a surprise to them. They were although they were informed the boat was coming, they were not given that much notice of it coming down to them. I don't know whether they were aware of a reason for it coming. And when it blew up, obviously, my understanding is the Spanish were very surprised by that. The implications of the explosion was that the US effectively declared war on the Spanish, and that had huge implications in regards to settling the war at the end. And we'll see what the implications were for the Spanish. And maybe why things in regards to settlement weren't so hard as they might have been. So a number of things going on around this time. So we've got Newton L. Bates. He's a very close friend and trusted medical advisor to President William McKinley. So he became, in 1897, he became Surgeon General by President McKinley. But he only lasted 18 days before he died. Apparently he took office whilst he was ill, and he died at the age of 59. Interestingly, he was married to the daughter of Dr. Benjamin in Franklin Bach. She was the great granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin, so interesting connection there. Now, we can't talk about President William McKinley without kind of going through what was going on around that time. So just to expand on that, now his position was taken by Admiral William K. Van Rapen, and he became the Surgeon General of the United States Navy to the Secretary of the Navy, John DeLong, which we just looked at, between 1897 and 1902. Now, the interesting thing about him is that he had a son. Later on, his son would be tapped into Skull and Bones. And that's something that comes up time and time again as you go through the history of Skull and Bones. You find that people that are contributing become key players and go along with maybe events. They get rewarded. Not directly necessarily, although they'll probably see job promotion. But the family almost gets folded into their plans. But it doesn't always work out, and for some reason, age 23, this young man dies. And it's worth noting that actually back then, there was quite a few. Well, obviously, with the lack of modern medicines, people were very susceptible to disease, especially during war. And so people were dying. But I find it interesting that maybe he was Skull and Bones and died at age 23. Very interesting that he was tapped. Okay, so let's just step back. Now he's also the Surgeon General through to 1902, which includes John DeLong, and he's Delta Kappa Epsilon as the Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. Now, to settle the Spanish-American War, the Spanish lost the war, and we can look at some of the details here. The war was between the 21st of April 1898 to the 13th of August 1898, so it's, in the scheme of things, quite a short war, but it cost the Spanish Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, which is a huge US military base, strategically, very, very important, and the Philippine Islands. And then when you look at who's connected and becomes a diplomat to the Philippine Islands, you find it's William Howard Taft. And I think the United States pays something in the region of $20 million is the number that I saw. And in regards to the number of people that died, around 385 on the US side died, and between 700 and 800 people from the Spanish side died. Okay, but the gentleman that settles for the Spanish is Alfonso the 13th of Spain. And this is where things maybe get a little bit more interesting, because he seems to be pretty empathetic towards the Spanish people from what I've seen so far through my research. Let me see. So by 1920 to 1926, to preserve its colonial rule over Morocco, the Battle of Anal was one of Spain's worst defeats. Whilst on holiday, and I think this is on the south of France, Alfonso's response to the news about the defeat was a shrug and a reference to chicken meat is cheap. Now, I can only imagine that quite a few people died if it's one of their worst defeats, and so to refer to that is shocking in such a way. And so he's almost accepting that what's happening is beyond his control. Yeah, it is what it is. So be it. And if you look at the number of prime ministers he had, he went through a shocking number of prime ministers. There's a lot. And that's one of the other things I find interesting is where they want change or almost, it's almost a question of prime prime minister to break the continuity, to break the progress to a certain degree, the line of thought. If you get that kind of thing, where you see a lot of change, it's not necessarily for a good reason. And it may be more contrived. There may be more reasons to do that, to break that line of thought. Anyway, so he becomes the King of Spain. He's settling. He's made King 13th on the back of Alfonso the 12th, and I find that interesting because I believe he was referred to as a peacemaker. Okay, he was highly respected, I think, is my understanding. If you're a historian, please add a comment. Right, if you disagree with that, then great. Yeah, add to the narrative. Let's understand what's going on. And a lot of these people are dying young. He's giving birth to various infants, and it's almost as if they don't want any continuity of line. And so things are happening where they're dying of different conditions. And what people tend to say is, but there was disease back then, and there wasn't the same medicines back then. But I question that, because these people are kept in palaces, right? It's a bit like our royal family. It's not too dissimilar to the fact that they don't really meet an awful lot of people. It's usually the same circles, pretty much within the same grounds. There's certainly nowhere near as much exposure to the common diseases that maybe diplomats might see as they're travelling in the world. And yet those diplomats, and you'll see that in my other presentations, live on to 60s, 70s. So I question why they're dying. I'm not comfortable with the explanation that they're dying of fevers. They may well be dying of fevers, of typhoid fever and whatever. But the question is, who's giving it to them? Why do they have it? Why is a peacemaker dying? And I think we'll find that peacemakers aren't good for business, and that would he have given away Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, or would he have fought for them? Would he have fought a harder fight? Would Alfonso the 13th, and let's just take a strong look at him, would he have challenged the strategy from his military advisors? Or would he have just accepted them and said, oh, well, it's chicken feed? Yeah. I'm not looking to provoke anyone. I'm asking questions. I'm questioning what's going on there. I don't think it's straightforward. I think it's interesting. And so the secret societies come up again. We'll find that actually Alfonso III is connected, along with his Alfonso the 12th, 13th and 12th, to this chap here, Abex Lamar Monroe Curry, his Phi Kappa Literary Society. Now again, I'm not an expert, but what I'm finding is that these societies and the connections that these societies have, and the influence that people like Rockefeller had and Carnegie had, they were looking for wars. And so we end up in this state where wars are good for business, and they're looking for the executive management to do what's necessary to execute that plan. And we find that he's the executive United States ambassador by President Grover Cleveland, who we know has strong connections to Skull and Bones. He arrives just before Alfonso the 12th dies. Arrives 49 days before King Alfonso the 12th dies. And he's there to promote free trade. So my understanding was that actually the Spanish economy under Alfonso the 12th was doing really well. And it created a problem with the exchange rate between the two currencies of the US and Spain. And the other thing that was going on, obviously, was Cuba. And one of the reasons Spain was doing so well was because of the sugar industry in Cuba. It was hugely profitable. Sugar was desired all over the world, and Cuba had become, effectively a hotspot for the production and sale of sugar. And interestingly, Rockefeller didn't have any of that business. And one of the things that comes up, and you can research James Perloff's 13 Puzzles, which is an interesting book, is that the national banks of Rockefeller open up all over Cuba after the US-Spanish War. In fact, I think it's you can go on to find, is it Mark Twain? So it was Mark Twain who would say, "Our hearts burned with indignation against the atrocious Spaniards, but when the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people in an increase in the price of commodities and rent, that is, when we sobered up from our patriotic spree, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the price of sugar." Okay. But I think it goes further than that, for a number of reasons. One, he was an honorary member of Scroll and Key. So he himself was an elected honorary member of a secret society at the age of 32. And then there were connections. So people like Henry Huntleston Rogers was a friend and supporter of Mark Twain. And supporter, you've got to be careful when you think, oh, he's not just going rah rah. I mean, back then, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't royalties of ads or anything like that. It was really a question of patronage, financing, writing. So you would have a patron. Now, I don't know whether that was the arrangement, but we've got to be careful how we interpret that. There's usually a financial dependency there. And Booker T. Washington. Rogers and Charles Pratt Institute sold their business, Charles Pratt and Company, to John D. Rockefeller. Okay, so Rogers became a significant person in Standard Oil. So back then, connections were everything. It's not like now where you have employment agencies. Certainly over the internet, lining you up with new opportunities, new jobs. It wasn't like that back then. Back then, you had to know people. You had to be connected. And if you wanted the senior positions, you had to be closely aligned with the secret societies, especially with people like John D. Rockefeller having such a huge influence over many industries. It wasn't just oil. He was influencing the railways. He was heavily connected to other important people. E.H. Harriman, who would himself have two sons that would go to Yale and become Skull and Bonesmen. That was William Averill Harriman and Edward Harriman. And when you look at that, William Averill Harriman would go on to finance Adolf Hitler through the Union Banking Corporation. And so there's so many connections there. In fact, in the same picture, if you just scroll down here, just touched on Germany, we find that 1893 to 1895, the United States ambassador to Germany by President Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley was indeed a Scroll and Key member, Theodore Runyon. He was he assisted in the creation of Scroll and Key, and so that was 1842. So he would have been one of the co-founders, along with Porter Addison. And so even that name, Porter Addison, becomes really important. Let's talk about Scroll and Key. Let's see what's going on. What we find is, when we go down here, is that let me find him. Yeah, there he is. What we find is that the secretary to President McKinley, and in fact he was the first person to hold this position, was in fact John Addison Porter. And he was the son of John Addison Porter of the same name, who was the co-founder of Scroll and Key. And so then we think about what's happening between Skull and Bones and Scroll and Key and maybe Wolf's Head. And when you do some research around there, what you find is actually that they agreed not to compete. At least that's my understanding. That they agreed to effectively sit alongside of each other. So in effect, they're working together. Although you do see some issues in history where, unfortunately, daughters such as Mary Meyer, who is the wife of Claude Meyer, who's connected to the JFK CIA environment, she dies. And I think even Claude Meyer suspected maybe even Skull and Bones, or maybe some people that are under control of maybe that society who are responsible for his wife's death. But anyway, so going back to John Lesson Porter, we find that he went to the Russell Military School. Well, the Russell Military School was founded by William Huntington Russell. He's the co-founder of Skull and Bones, right, with Alphonso Taft. And he graduated from Yale in 1833. And he went on to establish the Russell Military Academy, or school, in 1836. So anyway, so this gentleman, who's the secretary to the President McKinley, he dies intestinal disease around age 44, double numbers, which is interesting. 15th December 1900. So this is before William McKinley dies, and there's our William Howard Taft. He's governor of the Philippines after the battle. And so we've got William McKinley being assassinated on the 14th September. And he died from 2 shots to the stomach on the 6th September, so 12 days earlier, at the Pan American Exposition, age 58, by Leon. Now, Leon is a member of the Knights Ladies, because I think there were 2 fraternities, so he was a member of the Knights of the Golden Eagle, and that was a secret fraternity that started in 1872 and assisted by the Oddfellows and Knights of Pythias in becoming established. So it'd be interesting to understand what his line of thought was. It may have been that he was concerned about William McKinley securing the passage of the Gold Standard Act, rejecting free silver, expansionary monetary policy, because that was highly contentious back there. I mean, Jackson did a lot of fighting around monetary policy, and there were quite a number, I think, quite a number of assassination attempts. And then when you bear in mind that William McKinley himself, came up through the system, and we can see here he's the 39th governor of Ohio, which is the home of Standard Oil. And then we look at maybe what's going on around there, and we find that, according to Fernand Lundberg, in his Classic American 60s Families book, I believe, President McKinley was beholden to the Rockefellers and Standard Oil while governor of Ohio. McKinley went bankrupt and was secretly bailed out by a syndicate headed by the Rockefeller frontman Mark Hanna. Now, Mark Hanna's interesting because he's like a political master, very closely connected to John D. Rockefeller because they were high school classmates. So Mark Hanna's playing a role that's very, very similar to what Edward M. House played to Woodrow Wilson. And Edward M. House had a lot of Skull and Bones friends from his school days. Many considered him with the real White House boss. Critics called the president McHanna, which I can only imagine really irritated him. J.P. Morgan was another McKinley backer. Chicago's Chronicle of 14th of April 1898 commented, "The Rothschilds and Morgans control the White House." So they actually left out Rockefeller there. Maybe it was a Rockefeller best backed press. But we know the Rothschilds have been heavily involved in everything, including the Federal Reserve and many other things historically. And so would it surprise us that them and the Morgans control the White House? along with the Rockefellers? No, of course they do. He was bailed out by the Rockefellers. So they're all connected to it. Okay, so what happens to McKinley? And the answer is, well, he's given a bodyguard. But, and that bodyguard is William Craig. He's US Secret Service. And I don't know too much about him other than, I think he came from another country. It may have even been Scotland. Really need to check that. But before we go back to him, he's the bodyguard that's responsible for ensuring the safety of President William McKinley. Now, William McKinley gets shot twice. So whatever he was doing as a bodyguard, he decided not to interfere, or he was distracted, or someone was covering for him and didn't do their job either. At any event, despite a newly developed X-ray machine being displayed at the Pan American Exposition where he was shot, doctors were reluctant to use it to search for the bullet because they did not know what side effects it might have on him. In addition, the emergency hospital at the exposition did not have any electric lighting, even though the exteriors of many of the buildings were covered with the thousands of light bulbs. Doctors used a silver pan, to reflect sunlight onto the operating table as they treated McKinley's wounds in a room which was poorly equipped, no retractors. Basic tool. They lost the bullet because they didn't. This is the second bullet. They found the first bullet, they took that out. The second bullet they couldn't find, and they decided not to use the X-ray machine that would have found it. They lost the bullet. The lost bullet was left in the body, and the wound repaired. And I think even then they knew that doing that there's a high risk of blood poisoning. And so, what do you accept? The risk of blood poisoning, which was very high, or the one machine that may have actually have helped, and they chose not to use it. So anyway, some interesting decisions going on there, especially around the light bulbs. I mean, why would you not put light bulbs in the room? But they're basically used all over the exposition. Interesting decision. So who might be responsible for those kind of decisions? Well, it would be the person that had been working at the exposition whilst it was being set up in preparation for 1901. And so one of the deputy, and this is where it gets interesting, one of the deputy medical directors, and he was also referred to as assisting attending surgeon, so he would have been at this event, especially with the president there, I would have thought, was Werner Kensington. His Skull and Bones 1891. Let's go all over to him. So he has a great career. Seems to be rising up through the ranks, doing well. And he's then put in charge of the exposition, the medical side of the exposition, as deputy medical director. And then goes on to have a private hospital of his own. And so I find that interesting. But he does live to 68, which in the scheme of things, mind you, maybe he's got a bit of weight on him there. But it's interesting, isn't it, that being Skull and Bones, he's very, very closely connected to events that day. Okay, so let's go back to the bodyguard. What happened to him? Well, he then becomes the bodyguard to Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt goes to, I think it's San Francisco. And bearing in mind that he died from open air horse carriage being rammed by a speeding trolley car, aged 47. So he goes with Theodore Roosevelt to see Winthrop Murray Crane. Now he's interesting because he's a Republican politician. And this is what they said. As a senator, Crane was famous for his lack of public statements and behind-the-scenes manoeuvring. Chelsea Depew, another senator, wrote of Crane that he never made a speech. I do not remember that he made a motion, yet he was one of the most influential members of that body. Calvin Coolidge observed that his influence was very great and that it was of a intangible nature. He was often known to often inaction over action on many matters, with a common answer to requests for advice being do nothing. He was an opponent of reciprocity, reduced tariffs with Canada and the Dominion of Newfoundland, working to water down provisions of a proposed treaty. So he married Josephine Porter Boardman. That's the granddaughter of Joseph Earl Sheffield, a major benefactor of Yale, and father-in-law to John Addison Porter, Squall & Key's co-founder. And that's in 1906. Earlier, he married Mary Brenner, giving birth to Winthrop Murray Crane. And she died. She died in 1884. So let's just have a quick think about that. What's going on around then? Well, so sadly, her connection to that period is the death, I believe, during pregnancy. She dies, unfortunately, I think, giving birth to Winthrop Murray Crane. So Winthrop Murray Crane is tapped for Skull and Bones in 1904. So again, he's an insider. He's an advisor to Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is Skull and Bones 1878, the son of Alphonso Taft, the co-founder of Skull and Bones. And so that's all connected. You've got various other things going on around Eli Root, who became the president of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he was very, very close to William Howard Taft. And so let's just scroll down here. And just to mention, we did look at John Addison Porter earlier. His father is this chap up here, John Addison Porter. Okay. So interestingly, the Surgeon General at the time of William McKinley's, the personal physician to President William McKinley was this chap, Dr. Presley Marion Rixey. And he would be the personal physician to William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. But then he would go on in 1902 to become the Surgeon General of the United States by President Theodore Roosevelt. So where was he at the time of the president's assassination? Well, in connection, because of his duty with the executive mansion, I think that's the White House, it became necessary for him to accompany the president upon all journeys taken by the chief executive, that's the president, and thus it happened that he was in Buffalo when President McKinley was assassinated. He had been detailed by the president to accompany Mrs. McKinley to the Milburn House, whilst he received the people, so that he was not immediately at hand when the president was shot, but was promptly summoned, so that he was present and assisted with the operation and took official charge of the case. So actually, he's not there at the time of the assassination. So in those important hours directly after the assassination attempt, he's not at the president's side, despite being the personal physician to the president. It's almost as if he's been sent on a bit of a errand to get him out of the way. So let's just have a quick look at some of the other points around this mind map. William Sheffield Cowles, he was he commanded the gunboat Topeka and served as naval aide to President William McKinley. His son, he was the father of William Sheffield Cowles, who was involved in the fleet that left Pearl Harbor. If you remember, 2/3 of the fleet, I think, left Pearl Harbor, leaving a third there pretty much unprotected as the Japanese attacked. So that's a bit tricky. There's a separate mind map that deals with that. And then you have Francis Burton Harrison. Interestingly, he becomes the United States Commissioner of Claims in the Civil Service in the Philippines, bearing in mind they won the Philippines on the back of the Spanish-American War. You've got William Howard Taft, who becomes the Governor General of the Philippines, and then becomes the US President, and then becomes the Chief Justice. And so you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, yes, but this is back in the 1800s. Well, actually, no one's tackled this. They kept on tapping people, and they kept on building investment banks. That's Brown Brothers Harriman. They financed the Union Banking Corporation, which financed... Here we go. That's the Union Banking Corporation. There are 8 directors. 4 of them are Skull and... all of them, effectively, I think, were Harriman Brothers, but 4 of them are Skull and Bones. Harriman Brothers was a Skull and Bones shop. They financed Fritz Heisend, and he gave the money to Adolf Hitler. And that financed the Nazi Party. You think, well, okay, so, but we have, history. And the answer is, well, yeah, we do have history. But our history doesn't go into enough detail around what's going on. And so when we look at people and their stories, I Paid Hitler, we find that the people that are publishing it are Farrar and Reinhardt. And John Farrar is Skull and Bones, 1918. So what they've done is they've bought his story and they've published what they wanted of his story. What they haven't told you is that actually they're the people that financed Hitler. And they're not telling you a few other things, like they're also, unfortunately, the same people at Bletchley Park from the very beginning. And so more and more of our history unfolds. And again, some of that is part of a separate mind map. And then we go, well, okay, so we've got central intelligence agencies, right? I mean, they're there to protect us. Aren't they sort of doing the right thing? And the answer is, well, there are people there, and many of them are trying to do the right thing. But the problem is, you've got the secret societies there, and they are doing whatever they do. And bear in mind that the secret societies are heavily aligned with the wealthy families. And you go, well, how can that be? And the answer is very simple. The wealthy families set up large foundations, and they became the executive management to those foundations. And so when you start looking at the foundations, you find that actually they are the executive management to those foundations, and that goes back through history and to be completed, because I suspect there are many more. And then we find that they are Skull and Bones on the Council of Foreign Relations. Well, that's really important, because the Council of Foreign Relations have a huge influence on our society. And so that's why that's important. A lot of the companies in the world, many of you that are kind of maybe waking up have already seen this graphic. It's a low resolution here because I squeeze it in. But a lot of the companies roll up. And so they have a huge amount of influence on Earth. And so on. And it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And then you think, well, okay, how's it relevant to today? Well, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates have spent 3.6 trillion on the United Nations World Health Organization. And they